The worn bristles of the scrub brush dug into the palm of her hand, a familiar, punishing rhythm against the marble floor. 1, 2, 3, circle. 1, 2, 3, circle. The scent of bleach and lemon cleaner was the scent of her life, sharp and sterile. It burned in her nostrils, a constant reminder of her place. From her position on her knees, Eleanor saw the world as a series of expensive shoes. Italian leather polished to a mirror shine. Silk slippers that whispered across the hall. Today, it was the sensible, ugly flats of the other maids, gathered by the service door. Their whispers were not as quiet as they thought. "Look at her." A voice, sharp as broken glass, hissed. It was Beatrice. "She takes up the whole corridor. He must have to special order those uniforms." A snicker followed. He should order her a special salad. Maybe then she could move faster than a glacier. Eleanor's shoulders tensed, her scrubbing motion faltering for a half-second. She squeezed her eyes shut, focusing on the gray veins in the white marble. They looked like frozen lightning. She was used to it. The dark blue uniform, stretched taut across her broad shoulders and soft hips, felt like a target. In a house built on sharp angles and severe elegance, her curves were an unwelcome intrusion. She was a piece of furniture that did not match the decor. Her size made her first an object of pity, then of scorn. It was easier for them to see her as a joke than as a person. So she made herself small, quiet. She scrubbed floors, polished silver she could never afford, and disappeared into the walls. However, the silence of the mansion was a fragile thing. Today it shattered. A crash echoed from the direction of the kitchen, followed by a string of furious, guttural shouting. It was Antoine, the chef, a man whose temper was as legendary as his sauces. Doors slammed, more shouting, then a profound, ringing silence. Mrs. Gable, the house manager, a woman who moved through the world with the rigid posture of a drill sergeant, appeared in the main hall, her face a pale, strained mask. Beatrice and the others scattered, melting back into their duties. Eleanor, however, was trapped, a slow-moving vessel in the middle of the hallway. Mrs. Gable's eyes, sharp and frantic, landed on her. "You, get up." Eleanor pushed herself to her feet, her knees aching. She wiped her damp hands on her apron, her heart starting a low, anxious thrum against her ribs. "Antoine has resigned," Mrs. Gable said, the word tasting like poison in her mouth. "Effective immediately." Eleanor just nodded. It was not her place to speak. "Mr. Moretti is hosting the capos tonight," the house manager continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, panicked whisper. "The dinner is in 3 hours. There is no food." "No, chef." The caterers I called laughed at me. The air grew thick with unspoken disaster. In this house, failure was not an option. Mistakes were not tolerated. A failed dinner for Marco Moretti's most important lieutenants was more than an embarrassment. It was a sign of weakness. Eleanor's mind raced. She thought of her grandmother's kitchen, the scent of garlic and rosemary, the weight of fresh pasta dough in her hands. She thought of the worn, food-stained recipe cards she kept tucked away in her small room in the staff quarters, her only real possessions. She had learned to cook out of love. It was the one place she was not clumsy or slow. In the kitchen, her hands knew what to do. Her body, so often a source of shame, became an anchor of strength as she kneaded and stirred, lifted and carried. "I can cook," she said. The words were a tiny pebble dropped into a vast, silent ocean. Mrs. Gable stared at her as if she had just confessed to murder. A flicker of disbelief, then outright scorn, crossed her face. You're a maid." "My grandmother taught me," Eleanor said, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. "I know how. Real food. Italian food." Desperation warred with pride on the older woman's face. She looked down the hall, toward the silent, imposing doors of Marco Moretti's office. She looked back at Eleanor, at her plain, earnest face and her sturdy frame. The desperation won. "Fine," Mrs. Gable snapped, the word cracking like a whip. "You have 2 hours. If the food is not on that table, perfect, do not bother coming back to work tomorrow. Do you understand me, girl? Eleanor understood. She was already invisible. Now she was also disposable. But as she walked toward the gleaming, stainless steel kitchen that Antoine had abandoned in a fury, a different feeling began to bloom in her chest. Something hot and unfamiliar. It was not fear. It was purpose. The kitchen was a temple of chrome and copper, cold and impersonal. Antoine's domain. But Eleanor saw past the sterile surfaces. She saw a hearth. She tied on a clean white apron over her uniform, the crisp fabric a kind of armor. She opened the massive walk-in refrigerator, its contents a testament to a chef's ego. Foie gras, truffles, ingredients meant to impress, not to nourish. She ignored them all. She found what she was looking for in the back. San Marzano tomatoes, pancetta, good, hard pecorino cheese, onions, garlic, a beautiful cut of beef chuck. Her hands, which had been clumsy with a scrub brush, became instruments of grace. She moved with an economy and speed that would have shocked the other maids. The knife was an extension of her arm, dicing onions with a rhythmic, hypnotic chop. The scent of pancetta rendering in a heavy-bottomed pot began to fill the air, a warm, savory perfume that pushed back against the mansion's cold sterility. She worked without thinking, her body remembering rhythms learned in a kitchen a world away from this one. She was not a maid. She was a cook. 2 hours later, a deep, fragrant beef ragout simmered on the stove. Beside it, a pot of water boiled, ready for the fresh pasta she had rolled and cut by hand. A simple salad of bitter greens was dressed and waiting. The smell, rich and intoxicating, had begun to drift through the service corridors. Beatrice peeked in, her face a mask of astonishment, then vanished. Mrs. Gable returned, her expression grim. They are seated, she looked at the pots on the stove, at the flush on Eleanor's cheeks, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than disdain entered her eyes. It might have been hope. Eleanor plated the food with the help of a terrified-looking junior maid. The pasta, glistening with the dark, rich sauce, was mounted high, a generous dusting of cheese blanketing the top. It was not fancy. It was not delicate. It was food. It was honest. She did not watch it go out. Her part was done. She leaned against the counter, the adrenaline draining out of her, leaving a profound weariness behind. She had done her best. Now she could only wait for the verdict. The dining room was a cavern of mahogany and silence. Marco Moretti sat at the head of the table, a position he occupied with the absolute stillness of a predator. His suit was dark, exquisitely tailored, his hands resting on the table on either side of his plate. On his right pinky he wore a simple gold signet ring. It was the only ornament on a man who was otherwise a study in severe control. His capos, hard men with lifetimes of violence in their eyes, sat in silence, waiting for him to make the first move. The plates were set before them. The aroma rose, a ghost of 1,000 Sunday dinners. It smelled of family, of home. It was a scent that did not belong in this room at this table. Marco looked down at his plate. He picked up his fork. The room held its breath. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he took another, and another. Around the table the other men began to eat. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound. The food was not merely eaten. It was consumed with a focused, almost reverent intensity. When the plates were empty, Marco set his fork down. The sound was unervingly loud in the quiet room. He looked at Mrs. Gable, who stood like a statue by the door. "Who cooked this?" he asked. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that carried more weight than any shout. "The maid, sir," Mrs. Gable said, her voice tight. "Eleanor." Marco's gaze drifted from his plate, past his men, toward the kitchen doors. He said nothing else. But the order was given the next morning. Antoine would not be replaced. The maid, Eleanor, was the new cook. It was not a request. It was a decree. She had thought she was just filling in for one night. But now she understood. She had fed his family, his kapos, and in his world that was not a small thing. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, and Marco Moretti had seen her. She was no longer invisible, and she could not leave. The kitchen became her sanctuary and her prison. The mockery from the other staff did not stop, but it changed. It was laced now with a grudging resentment. They saw her elevation not as a result of talent, but as a fluke, an undeserved stroke of luck. Eleanor ignored them. She found her voice in the rhythm of her work. The daily bake of fresh bread, the slow simmer of stock, the methodical prep for the evening meal. The mansion began to change. The cold, sterile air, once scented only with polish and old money, now carried the aroma of roasting garlic, fresh basil, and caramelizing onions. It was a subtle transformation, a softening of the house's hard edges. The guards, broad-shouldered men who moved with a quiet, lethal purpose, started finding reasons to pass through the kitchen. At first, they were silent, their eyes following her movements. Then one day, a guard named Sal, an older man with kind eyes and hands like gnarled roots, spoke. "Smells like my mother's house on a Sunday," he said, his voice rough. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, shy smile. She handed him a piece of warm focaccia, glistening with olive oil and sea salt. He took it with a nod of thanks, and from then on, a silent understanding existed. She fed them, and in return, they offered her a quiet, watchful form of respect. She was no longer just the chubby maid. She was Eleanor. She was the cook. Marco Moretti remained a ghost. He took most of his meals in his office, trays delivered by Mrs. Gable. Eleanor only knew her food was accepted because the plates came back empty. She learned his preferences through observation. He liked simple, robust flavors. Nothing fussy. He ate what was put in front of him without complaint, but also without praise. He was an absence, a gravitational force she orbited but never saw. Until the night he came for a glass of water. Eleanor was cleaning up, her movements slow and tired in the late hours. The mansion was silent, asleep. She was wiping down the stainless steel counters when she felt it. A change in the air, a sudden stillness. She turned, and he was there, standing in the doorway. He was larger than she had imagined, his presence filling the space. In his dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, he looked less like a crime boss and more like a man carrying the weight of the world. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "I'm sorry," she stammered, reaching to untie her apron. "I was just finishing up." "Don't stop," he said. His voice was softer in the quiet kitchen, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air. He walked to the sink and drew a glass of water, his movements deliberate and noiseless. He did not drink it. He just stood there, holding the glass, watching her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She could feel his eyes on her, a focused, analytical gaze that missed nothing. She felt a familiar flush of self-consciousness, acutely aware of her size, of the way her uniform strained at the seams. She expected a look of dismissal, of distaste. She did not get one. He just watched. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his question so unexpected it startled her. "Stay? In this house? You could have found work elsewhere." She thought for a moment, wanting to give an honest answer. "I don't know," she said finally. I like feeding people." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his dark eyes. He took a slow sip of his water. "My mother liked to feed people," he said, the words quiet, almost to himself. "She used to make braciole, stuffed with breadcrumbs, pine nuts, and cheese. She said it was food that tasted like a hug." He looked at Eleanor then, a direct, piercing gaze that made her feel as though he could see right through her skin, into the lonely, hopeful parts of her she kept hidden. "Can you make that?" "Yes," she whispered. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture. He placed the glass in the sink, the sound precise in the stillness. "Tomorrow," he said. It was not a question. He left as silently as he had arrived, a shadow receding into the darkness of the mansion. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had spoken more to her in those 5 minutes than he had to anyone else in the house in weeks. He had told her something personal, a memory, a wound, and in doing so he had handed her a key. She did not yet know what lock it would open. The next evening, the scent of slow-braised braciole filled the dining room. Eleanor had taken meticulous care, stuffing and rolling the thin slices of beef exactly as she imagined a loving mother would. She sent it out with a simple polenta and roasted vegetables. She waited in the kitchen, her nerves frayed. This was different from the first night. That had been about survival. This felt like a test, a summons. An hour later, Mrs. Gable returned with the tray. The plate was clean. On it, next to the polished silverware, was a single, perfect gardenia, cut from the mansion's greenhouse. There was no note. There did not need to be. From that day on, Marco ate in the main dining room every night. Alone. He never spoke to Eleanor, never summoned her. But the ritual was established. She would cook for him and he would eat. It was a strange, silent conversation held over miles of polished mahogany. She began to learn him through his food. She learned he craved comfort, dishes that spoke of warmth and tradition. She learned that on nights when the tension in the house was high, when his men were grim-faced and silent, he barely touched the complex dishes but would devour a simple soup and bread. Her cooking had become more than a job. It was a responsibility. It was a way of caring for this dangerous, solitary man who held her life, and the lives of everyone in the house, in his hands. She was becoming a fixture, a part of the architecture of his life. Therefore, when the real danger came, she was standing right in its path. The dinner with the Fabri family was a masterpiece of passive aggression. Lorenzo Fabri, a man with a smile that never reached his cold, dead eyes, sat across from Marco, the air between them crackling with unspoken threats. Eleanor served the main course, a roasted lamb she had seasoned with rosemary and garlic. As she placed the platter on the table, Fabri's eyes raked over her, a slow, insulting appraisal. "You keep your staff well fed, Moretti," Fabri said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Generous of you." The room went absolutely silent. The insult was clear, aimed at Eleanor but intended for Marco. It was a jab at his household, at his taste, at his control. Eleanor froze, the heat of shame rising in her cheeks. Marco did not look at Fabri. He did not look at Eleanor. He calmly picked up his wineglass and took a sip. "In my house," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "loyalty is rewarded, and disrespect is addressed." He set the glass down. The message was delivered. Fabri's smile faltered. The dinner concluded in a tense, clipped silence. But a line had been crossed. Fabri had seen her. He had seen Marco's subtle, possessive defense of her. He had identified a potential weakness. A week later, the mansion was shaken by an explosion a few blocks away. A car bomb, intended for Marco's convoy. He was unharmed, but 2 of his men were not. He returned to the house not with fury, but with a chilling, lethal calm that was far more terrifying. He locked himself in his office, refusing to see anyone, refusing to eat. Eleanor watched the untouched dinner tray sit outside his door for hours. She knew he needed to eat. He needed strength. Acting on an instinct she could not explain, she went back to the kitchen. She heated a simple, clear chicken broth, the kind her grandmother used to make when she was sick. She poured it into a mug and placed it on a small tray with a single slice of her fresh bread. She walked to his office, her heart pounding. She did not knock. She simply left the tray on the floor by the door and walked away. It was a risk, an overstepping of her bounds. But the thought of him in there, alone and wounded in spirit, was something she could not bear. Hours later, when she passed by again, the tray was gone. The true betrayal, however, came from within. A young kitchen porter named Leo, a boy she had been kind to, was passing information to Fabri. His task that night was simple. A tasteless, fast-acting poison in Marco's wine. Eleanor saw it. The flicker of movement as Leo stood by the decanter. The slight tremor in his hand. The way he avoided her eyes afterward. Her blood ran cold. She could scream, call the guards. Leo would be dead before he could draw another breath. But she saw the sheer terror in his eyes. He was a child, caught in a game he did not understand. She thought of Marco, of the broth. She made a choice. As the wine was being carried out, she tripped, sending the tray crashing to the floor. The crystal decanter shattered, red wine bleeding into the white grout. Amid Mrs. Gable's shrieks and Leo's panicked gasps, Eleanor calmly apologized for her clumsiness. She cleaned up the mess herself, making sure every shard of glass and every drop of poisoned wine was gone. She had saved Marco's life, and she had become an accessory. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Marco knew. He did not know how, but he knew something had happened. He cornered her in the pantry later that night, the small space suddenly feeling airless. "Tell me what happened tonight, Eleanor," he said. It was not a request. "I was clumsy. I dropped the wine," she said, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his. He studied her face, his gaze intense, searching. He saw the truth she was hiding, and he saw the reason for it. She was protecting his house, protecting him. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. He smelled of sandalwood and something else, something uniquely him. "You belong in this house," he said, his voice a low murmur. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, a claim. "You are mine to protect." The confession hung in the air between them, not of love, but of ownership, of loyalty. He knew she had lied for him, and she knew that he knew. Leo was discovered a few days later, not by Marco's men, but by Fabri's. His failed attempt had made him a liability. His body was found in the river. Eleanor felt a cold knot of guilt in her stomach. Her mercy had been for nothing, but it had sent a clear message to their enemy. Marco Moretti's cook was loyal. Fabri now knew that to get to Marco he might have to go through her. The attack came on a Tuesday, her market day. It was the one time she left the suffocating security of the mansion. She loved the chaos of the market, the vibrant colors of the produce, the shouts of the vendors. It was a brief, welcome return to the real world. They came for her near the fishmongers, two men, their movements too slick, too purposeful for the crowded market. She saw the glint of steel. Her breath caught. There was no time to scream. She did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed a crate of ripe tomatoes and hurled it, sending a cascade of red pulp and screaming chaos across the cobblestones. In the confusion, she ran. Not toward the street, but deeper into the market's maze of stalls. She was not a fighter, but she was smart. She overturned a cart of apples, dodged behind a flower vendor, using the crowd as her shield. She was buying time, creating a disruption. She was not waiting to be rescued. She heard shouts, the screech of tires. Sal and another of Marco's men appeared, their faces grim, guns drawn. The two men who had been after her vanished into the crowd. Sal grabbed her arm, his grip firm, pulling her toward the waiting black car. "Boss wants you back at the house. Now," he said, his voice tight with adrenaline. She was bundled into the car, the scent of tomatoes and fear clinging to her. She did not cry. Her mind was strangely calm. The world she had tried to keep at bay had finally reached out and touched her. When she returned to the mansion, it was on lockdown. Marco was gone. He did not return until well after midnight. Eleanor was in the kitchen, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold a knife, but she was forcing herself to chop vegetables. The familiar, mindless task was the only thing keeping her grounded. She heard him enter, the soft click of the kitchen door. She did not turn. She kept chopping. Celery, carrots, onions. A base for soup. A base for everything. He came to stand directly behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He placed his hands on the steel counter on either side of her, caging her in. His knuckles were bruised. "It's over," he said, his voice a low, tired rumble against her back. "Fabri is gone. He will not bother you again. She stopped chopping, her shoulders slumping in relief. The knife fell from her hand with a clatter. He did not move. He leaned in, his face close to her hair, and inhaled deeply. "This house was just a building before you," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Cold. Empty. Now, it is a home." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gently wrapping around hers. He turned her to face him. His dark eyes, usually so guarded, were open, raw. "My home," he said. The cost of that statement was her entire old life. The simple, invisible existence she had once known was gone forever. She was his now, in a way that had nothing to do with contracts or employment. She was a part of his world, a world of violence and shadows, held together by brutal loyalty. He led her out of the kitchen, his hand still holding hers. He did not take her to her small room in the staff quarters. He led her into the grand dining room, dark and silent. The long mahogany table stretched out like a sleeping beast. He walked her to the head of the table, to his chair. He pulled it out. He did not ask her to sit. He did not need to. He simply looked at her, his eyes conveying the silent command. "This is your place now." Eleanor looked at the chair, at the man standing before her, a king in his castle. She had come to this house to be invisible, to scrub floors and disappear. Instead, she had fed an army, tamed a monster, and found a home in the most dangerous place imaginable. With a deep breath, she sat down. Marco pushed the chair in. He remained standing behind her, his hand resting on the carved wood of the chair back, a silent, possessive guard. The room was dark, the table was empty, but for the first time, it felt full. An empire of fear, now centered on the woman who smelled of fresh bread and loyalty.